Dean Martin was the first person to arrive at the hospital when Sammy Davis Jr. had his accident. After the surgery, when Sammy looked at Dean with tears in his eyes and asked, "What happens now?" Dean's response revealed the true depth of their friendship and proved that some bonds are stronger than fame, fortune, or even tragedy. It was November 19th, 1954, and the phone call that would change everything came at 3:47 in the morning. Dean Martin was sound asleep in his Beverly Hills home when the ringing jolted him awake. He'd been performing at the Copa Room in Las Vegas just hours earlier, had flown back to Los Angeles, and was finally getting some rest after what had been an exhausting week of shows. The voice on the other end belonged to Will Maston, Sammy Davis Jr.'s uncle and longtime manager, and Dean could tell immediately that something was terribly wrong. "Dean, there's been an accident." Will's voice was shaking. "Sammy, he's hurt bad, real bad. They've taken him to San Bernardino Community Hospital." Dean sat up in bed, instantly alert despite having only slept for 2 hours. "What kind of accident? What happened?" "Car crash. He was driving back from Vegas and—" Will's voice broke. "Dean, they don't know if he's going to make it. They're operating now, but they said you should come." Dean was already reaching for his clothes. "I'm on my way. Don't let them do anything until I get there." The drive from Beverly Hills to San Bernardino normally took about an hour, but Dean made it in 45 minutes, his 1954 Cadillac eating up the miles of desert highway as the sun began to rise over Southern California. He'd called Frank Sinatra from the car, but Frank was in New York and couldn't get a flight out until evening. Dean would be alone for this vigil, at least for the first several hours. Sammy Davis Jr. was 29 years old and one of the most talented performers Dean had ever known. They'd met 2 years earlier when Sammy was still performing with the Will Maston Trio, and Dean had immediately recognized something special in the young entertainer. Sammy could sing, dance, play multiple instruments, do impressions, and command an audience in ways that left even experienced performers in awe. But more than that, Dean had connected with Sammy on a personal level that transcended their professional relationship. Both men understood what it meant to come from nothing, to face rejection and prejudice, to fight for respect in an industry that didn't always want to give it. Dean faced discrimination for being Italian-American. Sammy faced much worse for being black. They'd bonded over that shared experience and had developed a friendship that was genuine, deep, and completely unconcerned with the racial barriers that divided so much of America in 1954. Dean arrived at San Bernardino Community Hospital just as the sun was coming up over the San Gabriel Mountains. The hospital was a modest brick building that served the working-class communities of the Inland Empire, not the kind of place that usually saw celebrities. But it was the closest facility to where Sammy's accident had occurred. The waiting room was small and sparsely furnished, with uncomfortable chairs and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look pale and tired. Will Maston was pacing near the windows, still wearing the clothes he'd had on for last night's show. Sammy Davis Sr., Sammy's father, sat in a chair with his head in his hands. "Any news?" Dean asked immediately. Will shook his head. "They've been in surgery for 3 hours. The doctor came out once to say they were still working, but—" He gestured helplessly. Dean sat down beside Sammy Sr. and put a hand on the older man's shoulder. "Tell me what happened." The story came out in pieces. Sammy had been driving back from Las Vegas after their show, taking his usual route through the Mojave Desert. He'd been tired, had been working 6 shows a week for 2 months straight, but he'd wanted to get home to Los Angeles rather than stay another night in Vegas. Somewhere near Victorville, on a straight stretch of highway with no other traffic visible, Sammy's pink Cadillac had collided with another car that had apparently run a stop sign. The other driver had been drunk, had walked away from the accident with minor injuries, but Sammy had been trapped in his car for 20 minutes before the fire department could extract him. The injuries were severe: multiple fractures, internal bleeding, and, most seriously, trauma to his left eye that might cost him his vision entirely. Dean listened to the details with the focused attention of someone who understood that every fact might be important later, but what struck him most was how quickly everything could change. 12 hours earlier, Sammy had been on stage in Vegas, electrifying an audience with his energy and talent. Now he was fighting for his life in a small-town hospital, and nobody knew what the outcome would be. At 8:30 a.m., Dr. Frederick Hull emerged from the surgical suite. He was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who had delivered both good news and bad news more times than he cared to count. "The surgery went well," he said, and Dean felt the tension in his chest release slightly. "We've stabilized the internal bleeding and repaired the fractures. Mr. Davis is going to survive." Will Maston let out a sound that was part sob, part prayer of gratitude. Sammy Sr. covered his face with his hands. "But," Dr. Hull continued, and Dean knew that everything important was going to come after that word. "There was significant trauma to his left eye. We did everything we could, but we had to remove it. I'm sorry." The silence in the waiting room was absolute. Dean felt like someone had punched him in the stomach, but he forced himself to remain calm because he could see that Will and Sammy Sr. were barely holding themselves together. "What does that mean for his recovery?" Dean asked. For his ability to perform?" Dr. Hull chose his words carefully. "Physically, he should make a full recovery from his other injuries. The eye, he'll need time to adjust, to learn to compensate for the loss of depth perception. Some people adapt very well. Others find it more challenging." What he didn't say, but what everyone in the room understood, was that Sammy's career as a performer might be over. Dancing, singing, playing instruments, doing impressions, all of it required the kind of physical coordination and confidence that might be impossible with the loss of an eye. "When can we see him?" Dean asked. "He's still sedated, but he should be waking up within the next few hours. I'll let you know when he's ready for visitors." For the next 4 hours, Dean sat in that uncomfortable waiting room chair and refused all suggestions that he go home, get some rest, come back later. Frank called from New York to check on the situation. Joey Bishop called from Chicago. Peter Lawford called from the studio where he was filming. But Dean stayed. He sent Will and Sammy Sr. home to shower and change clothes, promising to call if there were any developments. He bought coffee from a machine that dispensed something that barely qualified as coffee, and ate a sandwich from the hospital cafeteria that tasted like cardboard. At 1:15 p.m., Dr. Hull returned to the waiting room. "He's awake," the doctor said, "and he's asking for Dean." Dean followed Dr. Hull down a corridor that smelled of disinfectant and floor wax, past rooms where other patients were dealing with their own crises and recoveries. Sammy's room was at the end of the hall, a small private room with a single bed and a window that looked out on the hospital's parking lot. Sammy was propped up in bed, his head wrapped in bandages that covered the left side of his face completely. His right eye was open, and when he saw Dean, he tried to smile, but the expression was weak and uncertain. "Hey, Sam," Dean said, pulling a chair close to the bed. "How you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck." Sammy's voice was hoarse from the anesthesia and the trauma. "But I'm guessing that's not far from the truth." Dean sat down and leaned forward so Sammy could see him clearly with his remaining eye. "The doctor says you're going to be fine. Everything's going to heal up perfectly." Sammy was quiet for a long moment, and Dean could see him processing information, trying to understand a situation through the fog of medication and pain. "Dean," Sammy said finally, "I can't see out of my left eye. At all." Dean felt his throat tighten, but he kept his voice steady. "I know, Sam. The doctors had to remove it. But you're alive, and that's what matters right now." Sammy turned his head to look directly at Dean with his right eye, and the expression Dean saw there was something he would remember for the rest of his life. It wasn't self-pity or anger or fear exactly, though all of those emotions were present. It was the look of someone who was trying to figure out how to rebuild his entire understanding of himself and his place in the world. "Dean," Sammy said, his voice breaking slightly, "what happens now? I mean, really, what happens now? I can't dance the way I used to. I can't move around the stage like before. Hell, I don't even know if I can hit a golf ball anymore." Dean reached out and took Sammy's hand, something he would never have done under normal circumstances, because both men understood the unspoken rules about physical contact between male friends in 1954. But these weren't normal circumstances. "Sam, you listen to me, and you listen good," Dean said, his voice carrying an intensity that surprised them both. "You're going to do whatever the hell you want to do. You're going to perform. You're going to make people laugh and cry and forget their troubles for a couple of hours. And you're going to do it better than anyone else because that's who you are." Sammy's eye filled with tears. "But what if I can't? What if I try to come back and I'm just not the same?" Dean leaned closer, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Then I'll be right there with you. On stage, in the studio, wherever you need me. You think Frank and the guys are going to let you go through this alone? You think we're going to let some drunk driver and a stupid accident stop Sammy Davis Jr.? Dean paused, making sure he had Sammy's complete attention. "Here's what happens now, Sam. You get better. You take all the time you need to heal, to figure out how to do things differently, to get your confidence back, and while you're doing that, we're going to make sure there's a place waiting for you when you're ready." "But the business," Sammy started. "The business needs you more than you need it," Dean interrupted. "There's nobody else who can do what you do. 1 eye, 2 eyes doesn't matter. You've got more talent in your little finger than most people have in their whole body." Sammy was crying openly now, but they were tears of relief rather than despair. "You really think I can come back from this?" Dean smiled, the first genuine smile he'd managed since getting Will's phone call 13 hours earlier. "Sam, I don't think you can come back from this. I know you can, and I'll bet you anything you want that when you do, you'll be better than you ever were before. Because now you've got something to prove, not just to the audience, but to yourself." Dean stayed at the hospital for another 6 hours, until Sammy had fallen asleep and Will Maston had returned to take over the Vigil. As he drove back to Los Angeles through the desert night, Dean was already making plans. Phone calls to club owners, conversations with booking agents, meetings with choreographers who could help Sammy adapt his routines. But more than that, Dean was thinking about the promise he'd made. Not just the specific words about being there for Sammy's comeback, but the larger commitment he'd made to a friendship that transcended the usual boundaries of professional relationships. 18 months later, Sammy Davis Jr. returned to the stage at Cyro's nightclub in West Hollywood. Dean was in the front row, leading a standing ovation for a performance that was indeed different from the old Sammy, but also somehow more powerful, more moving, more authentic. The critics called it a miraculous comeback. Sammy called it the night he learned that the most important thing about performing wasn't what you could see, but what you could make other people feel. And Dean called it proof that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can become the foundation for the best thing you'll ever do. If this story of friendship, loyalty, and the power of believing in someone when they can't believe in themselves moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. Share this with anyone who needs to know that true friends don't abandon you when life gets difficult. They show up and help you find your way back. Have you ever had someone believe in you when you couldn't believe in yourself? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to ring that notification bell for more incredible stories about the friendships that change everything.